So Harlow is a ghost town.
We have a vision for this place. All it needs is young blood.
I don't want to live here. This is a chance for people to start fresh somewhere. Somewhere safe.
Hey guys, you should see this.
What are you doing in our house? You really shouldn't be here.
Oh my God.
This is Hardesty.
Sally, I'm afraid your old friend's back.
50 years I've been waiting for this night. Just to see him again.
Who?
Leatherface. Looks like it's you that he wants.
I'm not gonna let him kill you. Fear no evil. Fear no evil.
Try anything and you're canceled, bro.
Oh, fuck.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Cabin of Horrors podcast. Today, we are going over an awesome reboot movie that was featured in 2022 on Netflix. We're going to be talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I know this movie divided a lot of people in the horror community. There was a lot of people that didn't like it, but there were some people who liked it and enjoyed it. So I'm one of those people. I'm one of the people that really enjoyed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot and what Fede Alvarez did with it and really brought it to life. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, it contains 9 unique films, comic books, an upcoming video game adaptation, which I'm super excited for. And the franchise of movies consists of a cannibalistic spree killer named Leatherface and his family. They terrorize unsuspecting visitors who step foot on their territory in a desolate Texas countryside. The family is known for killing their victims and then subsequently cooking them, being cannibals. So in 1974, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie was released, and it completely shocked audiences. Society was not ready for a movie of that much violence and that caliber of horror. Society just wasn't ready for it. And the sheer terror of this movie struck fear in so many people that they actually were throwing up in the movie theater. People had to leave halfway through. Many people couldn't actually finish the movie in one sitting. And it really helped make it become one of the most iconic horror franchises in history. Now, the 2022 entry in the franchise, it serves as a direct sequel to the original film from 1974. The film was directed by David Blue Garcia, and it's from a story that was developed by Fede Alvarez and Rodo Sayags. The story of the film is set decades after the original, and it continues to focus on Leatherface while he targets a group of young adult entrepreneurs, and then he comes into conflict with a vengeful survivor from his previous murders. The cast includes Elsie Fisher as Lila, who's an amateur photographer and suffering from PTSD after surviving a school shooting. Sarah Yarkin plays Melody, who's a San Francisco entrepreneur on a business trip to turn a desolate Texas town into a budding community. Mark Burnham plays Leatherface, the masked chainsaw-wielding murderer that we see in the iconic Texas Chainsaw Massacre entries. And one of the most greatest castings in the movie that really pleased a lot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre fans was the fact that John Larroquette returned as the film's narrator. He provided the voice to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre film along with the 2003 remake and its prequel. So after the movie Leatherface was released in 2017, Lionsgate owned the rights at the time of the franchise, and they planned to develop 5 more movies in that timeline of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, they didn't produce the movies in time, and because of that, they actually lost the rights to the franchise. That's when Legendary came in. They came in and acquired the rights to the franchise and began working on a reboot sequel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. So principal photography on the film began in Bulgaria in August of 2020. And at that time, Ryan and Andy Tohill were the ones that were signed on to direct and create the film. However, the studio was completely unimpressed with what they had given them. So they fired Ryan and Andy, and then they were replaced by David Blue Garcia, and the footage that was originally shot by Ryan and Andy Tohill was not used at all. So this really presented Garcia with quite the challenge, right? Like, he had to start production from the beginning, and on top of this, he had to make Bulgaria look like Texas, which is a feat all of its own. So they decided to lean towards the idea of western Texas near the Fort Davis Mountains as the backdrop for the movie, because that was the closest they could achieve while filming in Bulgaria. So in March 2021, Fede Alvarez confirmed that production on the film was complete, and the film would focus on an older age Leatherface. Now, this incited a lot of mixed feelings in the horror community, as it really humanized the killer in a way, and it made him less of a terrifying killer, because if you're putting one of our favorite horror movie killers as a middle-aged person or as an older person, they can be perceived as weak at that point, right? You're humanizing them to the point that they don't seem to be the strong, domineering force that we know them as. And it was also mentioned that the film would be taking an old-school approach in its development, using vintage lenses and practical effects instead of using CGI, which this guy was definitely happy about. And the film was slated for a theatrical release in 2021. However, it was announced in August of that year that the film would skip theaters and be released exclusively on Netflix. It's assumed that this was due to the global environment and the pandemic. So the movie was then released on Netflix February 18th, 2022, and it remained at the #1 spot for over a week on Netflix. And that's when the toxic fandom of the horror community really began to bare their gritty teeth. The movie created a divide within the horror community, and for many different reasons. Personally, I'm going to say it right now so you know what side I'm on. Like I said before, I love the movie for what it was. At the end of the day, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not a story-driven franchise. It was never meant to have lore and be something that people really sunk their teeth into for a story. Yes, they really did put effort into providing a backstory for Leatherface in previous installments and different timelines of the franchise. However, it was all unnecessary, and it lost the original vibe of the first movie in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. Because the first entry was just literally a shock value gore fest. There was no backstory whatsoever. It was simply about a group of teenagers on a road trip who pick up a hitchhiker and shit goes downhill from there. Eventually, they run into a cannibalistic serial killer and his family, then they all die a bloody and brutal death, except for Sally. That's it. That's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's why people loved the first film and why it was so iconic. There's nothing that can be taken away from it from a story perspective, because there isn't one. And at the time that the first movie was released, it wasn't a critically acclaimed movie, right? The majority of people had to leave movie theaters before the film even finished because it was so graphic in nature. And it became one of those movies that kids actually dared other kids to go watch, and many people were vocally against it because of how graphic it was. And it took a long time for society to accept where the horror genre was going and that this type of movie wasn't going away. Eventually, of course, it became a cult classic and is idolized by many in the horror community, and a lot of people actually look at it as the first in the gore porn subgenre. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie that was released in 2022, it had similar controversies attached to it, but for different reasons. Many people felt the portrayal of Leatherface didn't accurately give the vibe of a cannibalistic serial killer because of his old aesthetic. When it comes to the appearance of Leatherface, I have to agree. It could have been done better. He reminded me kind of more of a sad clown than the terrifying wearer of faces that we know him to be, though that's really the only complaint I actually have about the movie. Others mentioned complaints of how the movie played off of stereotypical societal tropes, like cancel culture, millennialism, though this I don't understand the complaint, because the movie needed to take place in a modern setting. It had to make this new generation of viewers feel welcomed into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, so why wouldn't they include societal tropes from the time that it's released? That's the best way to attract newer audiences into the franchise and give them something to connect to. And I guarantee that the majority of new generation viewers who watch this movie did connect to it because of that. So it's a win-win. Yet I know a lot of you aren't going to see it that way. And speaking of which, because of all of the hype around it, it's actually being rumored that Netflix is going to be doing 2 more entries in this series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, so we'll have to wait and see if more is going to be released. So now we're going to dive deep into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. We are going to discuss the plot of the movie and what it's about. So if you have not seen the movie yet and you do not want spoilers on it, feel free to stop this podcast now and then come back over and say hi once you've watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. So it's been 50 years since the murder rampage of Leatherface and his family in 1973. News reports of the murders can be heard on TVs and shops around the desolate Texas town of Harlow, as young entrepreneurs Melody, Dante, Lila, and Ruth travel to auction off old properties to create a more trendy area in the town. Once they arrive, they find many structures abandoned, no one except a mechanic in sight. They're shown around the town when they discover a dilapidated orphanage, and they enter it, begin inspecting it. That's when they discover that the orphanage is actually still occupied by an elderly woman named Ginny, who claims she has papers to prove she still owns the property. This puts a wrench in the plans of these kids. They can't auction off all the properties in town now if one of them is actually held somewhere else. So they begin to argue amongst each other over who has the rights to the property when a silent and towering man appears upstairs and interrupts the argument. Once the argument subsided, Ginny collapses from a heart attack, and she's picked up by this towering man who is actually Leatherface and placed in an ambulance and rushed to the hospital. So in this quote-unquote ambulance, she's also with Ruth, who's communicating with the rest of her friends via text message to update them on the situation. In the meantime, Catherine's shown up in Harlow with a large bus of potential buyers for the properties in Harlow. While Melody and Dante are distracted with the onslaught of people coming in, Lila strikes up a conversation with the local mechanic, Richter, who then reveals to him that she was a school shooting survivor with PTSD towards guns. Then when we get back to Ginny in the ambulance, her health begins to deteriorate, and she eventually passes en route to the hospital. Ruth texts Melody and lets her know that Ginny's died, which throws a shroud of guilt over Lila as she believes their argument was the reason for her death. Although Leatherface certainly isn't happy that Ginny has died and begins to go on a murderous rampage in the ambulance, killing officers, crashing the vehicle into a ditch, and then Ruth is knocked out but awakens to find Leatherface cutting off Ginny's face from her dead body and puts it on as a mask. In a suspenseful moment that ensues, Ruth tries to reach for a radio and call for help, while Leatherface starts stalking the perimeter of the vehicle. Eventually, she's discovered by Leatherface and then brutally murdered. Back in Harlow, the property auction begins, while Melody reads Ruth's texts and prepares to leave with Lila. Richter overhears their discussions surrounding Ginny's death and the fact that they can't find the paperwork which gives them the rights over the property, so he takes the keys back from them and agrees, "I'll give you the keys back once you can prove that you actually own the property and remove Ginny from her home rightfully." So Melody and Dante go on a search in the orphanage. They try to see if Ginny actually had the paperwork, and then they can steal it to claim it as their own. So it's at this point of the film that we get some fan service, because we get to see the sole survivor of Leatherface's first killing spree, Sally Hardesty. She's now a battle-hardened Texas Ranger, and she hears of Ruth's attack on the radio. She loads up her gear, heads out to investigate the murders, and then back at the orphanage, Melody ends up finding the paperwork and discovers that they wrongfully removed Ginny, and they are the sole cause for her heart attack causing her death. So a pissed-off Leatherface is back in Harlow now, and he heads straight to the orphanage where he attacks and mutilates Dante. Melody hides under the bed as Leatherface retrieves his iconic chainsaw from the bedroom. Then night falls in Harlow. A thunderstorm hits, and that forces Catherine and Lila to take cover in the bus, along with all the other potential buyers who have come to see the properties in Harlow. Dante manages to stumble out of the orphanage, and he's discovered by Richter the mechanic before he bleeds out to death. Richter then heads into the orphanage, but he's immediately killed by Leatherface. Melody heads to grab the car and the bus keys from Richter's body in hopes of escaping Leatherface, but once they get on the bus, Leatherface is in hot pursuit, and he makes his way on board in one of the most gruesome scenes ever filmed. Everyone on the bus is slaughtered in a gory, gruesome fashion that is fitting for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. So Melody and Lila manage to escape the carnage when they run into Sally, who's now arrived in Harlow after she discovered that Leatherface is back and on another murderous rampage. She locks the two girls in her car while she heads into the orphanage and confronts Leatherface. Holding him at gunpoint, Sally demands that he remembers the pain that was inflicted on her and her friends. However, she's only met with silence, and Leatherface walks away without putting a single hand on Sally. Leatherface then makes his way towards the sisters who are locked in Sally's car and begins attacking them, though is thwarted by Sally, who shoots him. Melody ends up retrieving the keys from Sally to drive away as Sally continues on her hunt for Leatherface. There's an ensuing fight between the two of them, and Leatherface ends up murdering Sally in what some call a homage to Halloween Kills in that firefighter scene where Michael Myers lifts one of the firefighters in the air before slamming him to the ground. Very similar kill here, very similar kill. So Melody hits Leatherface with Sally's car and ends up crashing it into a nearby building. Leatherface, of course, reappears. He's not going to die that easy, and Melody apologizes for their role in Ginny's death. Leatherface doesn't accept apologies, though, and he moves in for the attack as Lila makes an attempt to shoot at him, though her gun's actually empty. There's no bullets in there. Sally shows up, makes her one last final appearance before her dramatic death, and shoots Leatherface as he flees away. So Lila takes Sally's shotgun. She goes on the hunt for Leatherface into an abandoned building where she ends up being ambushed and attacked. Melody shows up and steals Leatherface's chainsaw and uppercuts him with it, which knocks him into a pool of water where he sinks to the bottom. Both the girls escape. Lila retrieves Sandy's hat and puts it on her head as they begin their drive back home. Though we know Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies don't have happy endings, and there can only be one final girl. So Leatherface reemerges as they're trying to drive away and drags Melody out of the car, decapitates her with his chainsaw, and then hangs her head from his hand as the self-driving car takes Lila out of Harlow. Leatherface does his dance in the street with his chainsaw, and Melody's hand in the other hand to end the movie. There's also a post-credit scene attached to this film for those who may have missed it. We see Leatherface walking in the sunrise towards his original family home from the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie in 1973, which I found to be a beautiful connection and a great homage to the original film, and it also leaves the door open for sequels in this series and gives fans the hopes that we may see an iconic location back in the franchise. Now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise has had entries where they claim it's based on or inspired by a true story, and many people believe the story of Ed Gein is the same as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, while many elements from reality were used in the making of the original entry, it was only inspiration, and not directly derived from all the facts. Ed Gein was a real-life serial killer. He murdered several victims between 1954 and 1957. The most recognizable similarity between the real-life murders and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film is how gruesome the content which was found in Leatherface's home was. Another inspiration the film took from Ed Gein was the wearing of a human scalp and face. However, Ed Gein committed this act to help quell his desire of being a woman, where Leatherface's reasoning was due to a skin disease. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't the only franchise to take inspiration from Ed Gein. Norman Bates from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960 and Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs in 1991 were both also loosely based on Ed Gein. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot itself performed quite well on Netflix. It's currently sitting at a 32% critic score, though, and a 26% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Not many people actually like this movie, despite how well it performed. One of the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes is quoted with, "The constant winks and nods to social media drumming and current events take Texas Chainsaw Massacre to self-parody territory." Another reviewer mentioned, outside of a couple of inventive kills, the rest of the movie falls flat for relevancy or enjoyment. The final scare could have been a real shocker if the characters had any depth outside of their skin color and age. That's all you get here. Though despite some of the negative reviews, there is some love for the latest iteration of Leatherface. One reviewer is quoted as saying, "This one both is exactly what it needs to be and falls into a whole new set of traps at the same time." And another one that I align very much with says, "Is there a massacre with a chainsaw? Does it happen in Texas? Cool, 3 stars. Everything else is gravy." Because that's what Texas Chainsaw Massacre is. Everything that it is in the fucking title. Is it in Texas? Is there a chainsaw? And is there a massacre? Perfect. If it has those 3 things, then it is a good Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. Like, seriously, that's all it is meant to be. Like, I understand that people want lore in their movies. They want backstory. They want connection between movies. And I do too. I understand that. But there's certain franchises that just doesn't work with. So at the end of the day, this movie will continue to divide the horror community, right? Similar to what the original 1974 movie had done during its time, so keep that in mind. I'm confident that over the years, people are going to look back on this movie with different eyes and perspectives, and who knows, maybe they'll enjoy it once they move past their expectations of the film. And I want to thank everybody for tuning into this episode of the Cabin of Horrors podcast. Had a lot of fun going over the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie with you guys. There's going to be tons more coming up. Thank you for putting up with me and dealing with the 2-week hiatus of the podcast while we work some things out. I know I did mention I was going to be doing true crime episodes. That's going to be coming in the future. That's been put on the back burner. There's a lot of research and a lot of work that goes into doing true crime right and being effective with it. And the last thing I would want to do is tarnish anything or be disrespectful to anybody or trigger anybody. So the true crime episodes are going to be put on hold for the moment until I can learn more about it and effectively give you guys the content that I know you're going to want. So thank you again for tuning into this week's episode of the Cabin of Horrors podcast. I had a lot of fun. Can't wait for the next episode to come out. If you want more horror content, make sure that you're following us on Instagram, Cabin of Horrors podcast. We've also got a Twitter account if you're on Twitter, so follow us at Cabin of Horrors. And hey, One of our biggest hangout spots is on Twitch. So if you're on Twitch, come check us out on Cabin of Horrors. We have our weekend streams every single week, Friday night, Saturday night, and we play Elder Scrolls Online on Sundays. And sometimes during the week, you may see us live broadcast as well. So come on, head over to our Twitch and give us a follow. And if you have any feedback on this episode or you want to share your thoughts on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, let us know. Send us a message on Instagram. We always love to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks again for checking out this week's episode, and stay scared.